In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this procedural Christmas candy material. So as I record this, Christmas of 2023 is almost here, and so every year before Christmas, I love making Christmas themed tutorials. And if you have any Christmas themed tutorial requests, then definitely let me know in the comments. And you can also check out my Christmas tutorial playlist if you'd like to watch more of my Christmas themed tutorials. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create this procedural Christmas candy material, and after we create the procedural material, I'll show you how to join it together into this customizable node group. So we have the overall scale to change the size of the entire material, so you can have lots of lines or very little lines. And then we also have the different colors, so colors 1, 2, and 3. Then we have the amount of swirls, so you can make very few swirls or lots of swirls. And then my favorite value here, the candy variation. So you can use this candy variation to make it look very different. So there's a really cool one that's 0.38, or you could also do like this one here, that's a 0.59, or you could turn it up to a 1.35. So that one's pretty cool. There's just so many different variations you can get by changing the candy variation. Then there is the roughness of the material, and also the bump scale, and then also the bump strength for the surface of the candy. And if you'd like to help support me and this channel and purchase the material, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description. And to purchase all of my materials, you can check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, which has all of my procedural materials pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist to learn how to create all of my procedural materials. Alright, so real quick, I'll show you my scene setup if you want to set up the Blender file the same way that I have. And I do apologize that my screencast keys isn't working. The screencast keys add-on which I use isn't working in Blender version 4.0, so I'll have to figure that out and find an add-on that works to show my screencast keys. So in a new scene in Blender, you can press Shift A, and I'm going to go here to Mesh, and I'm going to add a cylinder. And then I want to scale this down so it is closer to the real-life size in Blender, because these objects on default are quite large. So I'm going to scale this object down by 0.1 and then hit enter, and I can press Ctrl A and apply the scale. Then I want to rotate the object, and I'll rotate it on the x-axis, and I'll type in 90 and enter, so it's rotated over by 90 degrees. Then I'll go into edit mode, and I want to scale this object down on the y-axis, and I'll make it quite a bit smaller, and then I think I might scale the whole thing up just a little bit. So I'm now going to click here to go to the face select, and I will select this face and shift select this face. And I'll press E to extrude and then S to scale, and I'll scale that up, but I want to just scale it on the y-axis, so I'll just scale that out on the y, bring it out maybe about that far, and then I can scale the whole thing down and maybe scale the whole thing down on the y-axis a bit, so something like that. Then I will press I again to inset those faces and just place that there. So now those faces are inset. So I'll go back to object mode with the tab key, and I'm going to press Ctrl 2. Ctrl 2 is going to add a subdivision surface, and then using the object context menu, I'll shade this smooth. Then I'm also going to press Shift A, and I'm going to go here and add a UV sphere, and I'll scale the UV sphere way down so it's much smaller, and I'll also press Ctrl 1 just to add a subdivision surface with one level, and then using the object context menu, I'll shade that smooth, and I'll bring this here, kind of rotate it over a little bit, and then I'll duplicate this one, maybe move it over here, and kind of rotate that a little bit. And then I'm going to select both of these spheres, and I'll press Ctrl A, and I will apply the scale, so that's the new default size of the objects. Then I also added a camera by pressing Shift A, going down here and adding a camera, and I just pointed the camera at the objects. And if you go over here to the object data properties with the camera selected, I turn the focal length up to 70 just so it kind of zooms the camera in a bit. Now as for the lighting, I added these 3 different area lights right here. So if you press Shift A, you can go down here to light and add the area light. And once you add the area light, you can turn the shape here to disk if you want to set it up the same way that I have, so that it is a circular light. So for all of these 3 lights, I have it as a white color, and I have the power to about 4. So I have one light shining on this side, another one on this side, and then another one kind of on the back to give a bit of a rim light. And then also to make the lighting a little bit nicer, if you go over here to the world properties, I added in this Photo Studio Broadway Hall 1K HDRI. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com, and I'll have a link in the description if you'd like to download it. So you can just add a new world, and then you can click click here on the yellow dot next to color, and you can choose environment texture, and then you can just click on the open button and open up the downloaded texture. And again, I downloaded the 1K HDR version of the HDRI. And then I set the strength of the HDRI to 0.4 so it's not quite as bright. Now if you go up here to the render properties and go down here to the color management, I am using Filmic, and I also changed the look to very high contrast just to pop out the colors and make it look nicer. And then if you open up the film tab here, I also turned on the transparent button so that the world lighting is still lighting the scene, but you can't actually see the HDRI in the background. And then also I'm using the Cycles rendering engine, but you could also totally use Eevee if you want to. Alright, so I'm going to click right here to go to the shading workspace. So in the shading workspace, I have the 3D viewport right over here, and I'm in the rendered mode. And then I have the shader editor right over here. So I'll just click on new to add a new material, and I'll just rename this to Christmas Candy. And if this principled shader looks a little bit different than yours, that is because Blender 4.0 was just recently released, and so they have updated the principled shader. It's still the same shader, but they've just changed the user interface a little bit. So if you don't have Blender 4.0, then you can definitely download it on Blender's website. But you should also be able to follow along in an earlier version of Blender as well. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on Edit and you can go to the Preferences. And then over there on the Add-ons tab, just search for Node Wrangler and you can enable the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So to start off, we are going to be creating the swirl texture. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the gradient texture. Let's drop the gradient here. And then using the feature of the Node Wrangler, you can Control Shift and then select different nodes. So just hold down the Control and Shift key and then select different nodes to preview them. So I'm just going to Control Shift and select the gradient, and you can see it's black over here and then it gets whiter. And also with the gradient texture selected, I'm going to press Control T to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And I'm going to bring these two nodes over here so we have a bit more space. Now on this gradient texture, I want to click on the type here, and I'm going to change it to a radial instead. And then I also want to click on this mapping node, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it here before the gradient, and we'll use this mapping later. Now you can't see the gradient texture, and that is because I want to use the object coordinates. So we're going to take the object and we're going to put that into the vector, and now you can see that it is black here, and then as it goes around, it gets lighter. So what I want to do is I want to distort the gradient texture so that as it goes out, it's going to rotate. So to do that, we're going to add another gradient texture and we're going to put it into the rotation, and then that'll distort the rotation. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a gradient texture, and we're going to drop it between both of the mapping nodes. Now, because this gradient texture is going to distort the rotation of the other texture, we actually want to take the gradient texture color and we're going to put that into the rotation of this mapping. And then the object coordinates can just go back into the vector of this one. So we'll just drag these two down so we have the mapping and the gradient, and then the object coordinates is going into this one. So then we just have the gradient going into the rotation so that it will distort it. So on this gradient texture, I want to click on the linear and I'm going to change it to spherical instead. So by being set to spherical, if I Control Shift and select it to preview it, it's going to be white in the center, and then it's going to get more gray as it goes out on the edges. And it is a little bit hard to see, but you can see it's white here and then it gets gray there. So I'm going to Control Shift and select the gradient again. So you can see that it's already started to distort it because it is kind of moving up at a weird angle, but I want to make it stronger. Before I do that though, I don't want it to be distorted on the Z-axis. So this mapping node here, we're just going to turn the Z to 0, and that way the gradient texture won't really be affected on the Z-axis, but it will be affected on the X and Y. So we're just turning the Z to 0. So now to make that distortion stronger, I'm going to press Shift A and I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for the math node, and we'll put the math node after the gradient texture. And then we want to click on the add here, and we want to change it to multiply instead. So change it to multiply under functions. And now if I turn the value up, you can see it's going to be stronger and stronger and distort more and more as I turn the value up. Now this multiply is going into the rotation, and so it is distorting the X, Y, and Z values. But instead of it distorting all three of these values, I only want it to distort the Z value. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the combine X, Y, Z, and let's just drop this here. And I'm now going to take the vector and we'll put that into the rotation. So that way these three values are now broken up into these three values. So we can take the multiply and we can plug that into the Z. So the X and Y will leave at 0, but I can now just turn the value up, and you can see because it's only controlling the Z, it is only going to rotate it around on the Z axis. So if I turn this up to a very large number, you can see we now have that really cool swirl there. Now on the multiply value, I'm going to turn this to 13 because I think 13 is a pretty good size. So now we have one of them, but I want to make many more of those lines because I want there to be lots of swirls all around. So I'm going to go over here to the gradient. I'm going to box select these nodes and bring them over, and then I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for another math node, and we'll drop the math node after this gradient, and this one as well, we're also going to change it to a multiply. Now before I do anything with this multiply, I also want to click on the multiply, and I'll duplicate it with Shift D, drop it here, and I want to click on the multiply, and I want to go down here to rounding, and I'll choose fraction. So now that we've added the fraction and the multiply, I can turn up this value, and you can see the bigger I turn it up, the more of those swirls we're going to have. So I'm going to turn the value up to 4, so you can see now there are just 4 of those lines. And also I'm going to click here, and I'm going to drag and drop this material onto these other objects as well, so we can preview that. Alright, so we can now start creating the colors. So I'm going to click and drag to box select these nodes and bring them back. And I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we'll drop the color ramp here after the fraction. Now I'm actually going to use this color ramp to kind of break up these values, so these black and white values, and we're going to use that to create a few more swirls. So what I'm going to do is click and drag, and I'm going to drag the black tab kind of over to about here, and then I'm going to hold down the control key and click here to add another tab, and I'll bring this over, and then this one I'm going to make white. So you can see by having white and then black and then white, it's kind of breaking up those values, so it's kind of changing the colors of those swirls. So this color here, I will put it in about the center. And then I want to make it a mid-gray color, so I'll just make it kind of like a mid-gray color. And if you want to use the exact same color that I'm using, you can go over to the hex value, and you can punch in 7A, 7A, 7A. And then I'm going to hold down the control key and click here, and also hold down the control key and click about there to add 2 more of them. And then I want both of these colors to be the same color, and I want them to be a bit darker. So if you click here on the tab and go to the hex value, here on the hex, I want to use 7F, 7F, 7F. That's the color that I'll be using. And then this color right here, I want to use the same color. So I'll click on the color here, go to the hex, and I'll punch in 7F, 7F, 7F. So now by adding these 3 gray color tabs right here, you can see that it's making that big gray area in those swirls. So we now have some big gray swirls. Now before I actually dive into the colors, I want to add a few more detailed lines. So I'm going to click on the multiply and then Shift select the fraction, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate, and let's drop these nodes up here. And I want to put the color ramp color into the multiply. Let me just drag these nodes over and then drag these down, and then I can Control Shift and select the fraction. So by adding another multiply and another fraction, you can see we're adding a bunch of little lines there in the gray line. And then this value right here, I want to change it to a 5.6. I think a 5.6 is pretty good. But you can see by dragging this value around, we can really change the variation of how the Christmas candy looks. And we'll be using this value later in the custom node group. So now I'm going to create the colors. So I'll give myself a bit more space, and then I'll press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for another color ramp, and let's drop this up here, and we can put the fraction value into the color ramp, and I'll Control Shift and select it to preview it. So I'm going to drag the black tab over here and the white tab over here, and because I'm going to be creating a customizable node group, I want to be able to have those colors that I can control outside of the node group. So what we're going to do is basically create a few masks with the color ramp, and then we will use the color ramp mask in a mix color node, and we'll use that to create the custom colors. So I'm first going to just drag this over here and then that over there, so just like that. And that is going to be the first mask. Now for the second mask, I'll select the color ramp and I'll press Control Shift D. So Control Shift D will duplicate the node but keep the wire plugged up, and I'll drop it here and I'll Control Shift and select it to preview it. And then this one, I want to drag the black tab over here, and then the white tab I'm going to drag over to about there. So now you can see we have those 2 different masks. And then there is just one more thing I want to do to the texture. I want to go back over here to this color ramp, and I want to drag these white tabs out, and by dragging the white tabs out, it's going to add that little dark area there in that mask. So just drag those white tabs out just like that. Alright, so now we can use these two masks and we're going to join them together to create the colors. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix color, and let's drop this up here. And I'm going to take this top color up here and I'm going to put the color into the factor. So by dragging it into the factor is determining what parts are going to be color A and what parts are going to be color B. So I can Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. So here on color A, I'm going to make this really bright and I'm going to make it a green color. And then here on color B, I'm just going to make this fully white. And if you want to use the same exact color for the green color, then you can go to the hex and you can punch in 00 FF18, and then color B is fully white. So I now want to mix this in with the other mask. So I'll click on the mix, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it and drop it here, and I want to take the mix result and I'm going to put that into color B. So now we can take this color ramp color and we can plug that into the factor. And I can Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. So then I want to go here to color A, and this color I am going to make fully red. And if you want to use the same exact red color that I'm using, then here on the red color, you can go to the hex value and you can punch in FF0400. So I can now take the mix result and I can put that into the base color, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. So now let's do a few more things to the material. So I want to make it more shiny, so I'll just turn the roughness down to a 0.2, and I'm also going to open up the subsurface here, and I'll turn the subsurface weight all the way up to 1 so there's more subsurface. And then here on the subsurface scale here, I just want to turn this to a 0.1. Now I also want to add a tiny little bit of surface bump, so I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for a noise texture and drop it here, and I can put the factor into the normal. Now there's some weird shading issues, and that's because I need to convert the color data into normal data, so I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for the bump node, and we'll put the bump node in between the noise texture and the normal. And then I want to take the factor and I'm going to put that into the height value of the bump. And then here on the bump strength, that is a bit too strong, so I'm going to turn that down to a 0.03 on the bump strength. Now I also want to use the object coordinates for the noise texture. So let's go back over here to this texture coordinate, and we're going to take the object coordinates and we're going to drag this all the way over and we're going to stick it into the vector of the noise texture. And then I do just want to change a few of the settings. So I'm going to turn up the scale to 200, and then I'll turn the detail up to 5, and then this roughness here I'll turn to a 0.588. And then I'll leave the other settings how they are. So if I Control Shift and select the noise texture, you can see that's what it looks like. And if I Control Shift and select the bump, you can see it's just going to add that tiny little bit of surface bump. So I'll Control Shift and select the principled shader. And that is the finished procedural Christmas candy material. So we're now going to be joining this together into a custom node group. So I'll click and drag to box select all the nodes except the material output, and I'll press Control G to join it together into a node group. And if you press the tab key, that'll go in and out of the node group. So I'll go out of the node group and I'll drag the node group over here, and I can drag it out to make it bigger. And then here on the name of the node group, I can just call this Christmas Candy. So then let's hit the tab key to go back into the node group, and I'll press the N key to open up the side panel. And you can click over here on group, and then here on the interface, you can see right now it's renamed to BSDF, but I want to rename this to Shader just because I like that a bit better. So outside of the node group, you can see that it's called Shader. So let's go back into the node group. So if you go over here to this side, you can see there is a group input, and so we can plug all the values that we want to control outside of the node group into this group input. So I first want to control the overall scale, and so this first multiply here, you can see that's going to change the scale. So we'll take the value and we'll put that into the group input. And then if I double click on this to rename it, I'm just going to rename it to scale. Then I want to be able to control the colors, so I'll drag the group input right over here, drag it way over here to these colors, and I first want to take this white color and put that into the extra socket, and then the green color, put that into the extra socket, and then the red one here, put that into the extra socket. And if you do want to move these around, you can click and drag and then let go, and that's going to move those around. So I'm going to double click on these to rename them, and I'm going to rename them color 1, and color 2, and color 3. So now if we go outside of the node group with the tab key, we have those different colors, and that'll control the colors of the material. So I'll go back into the node group. Now I also want to be able to control the amount of swirls. So if I drag this group input back over here, we have this multiply, and if I drag this around, you can see that's controlling how many swirls there are. So I'm going to take the value, put that into the extra socket, and then I can double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to amount of swirls. Then I want to be able to control the candy variation to make it look different. So if we go over here to this third multiply, I can drag this value around and you can see it's going to randomize the candy. So this is a great way to make lots of variations of the candy just by dragging this around. So let's put the value into the extra socket there, and then I can double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename this one to candy variation. And then I want to be able to control the roughness of the material. So let's go here to the principled shader, and I can take the roughness and I can put that into the extra socket, and then I'll drag the group input down here. And I also want to be able to control the noise scale. So I'll put that into the extra socket. So the noise scale, we can control that as well. And this one, I'll double click on it to rename it, and I'm going to rename it to bump scale. And then I want to be able to control the bump strength. So let's put the strength here, the bump, into the extra socket. And then if I double click on this, I can rename it to bump strength. All right, so I can drag the group input right over here and drag it underneath the texture coordinate, and I'll hit the tab key to go outside of the node group and the N key to close the side panel. So we have the overall scale to change the size of the material, and then we also have the different colors, so colors 1, 2, and 3. And I have them as green and red because those are classic Christmas colors. Then we have the amount of swirls, so I can make more swirls if I want. Then we have this cool candy variation value, so you can drag this around to make the candy texture look very different. Then we also have the roughness of the material and the bump scale, and then also the bump strength. So that's going to be it for this tutorial, so I hope you enjoyed this and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to watch more Christmas themed tutorials, then definitely check out my Christmas tutorial playlist. I'll have a link to that in the description. And you can also purchase this procedural material on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page, and that's a great way to help support this channel. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then you can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack. And to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist here on YouTube. All the links are in the description. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and Merry Christmas.